What's up, everybody? Matt Gajewski here, back again with the Awesemo team, talking some college football DFS ahead of the opening weekend for bowl season. We are going to talk the Saturday slate of games. It is broken down in different ways depending on your platform, but we will get to it all. Before we get started, make sure to hit that thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you know when this and all other content goes live. Bringing you behind the glass for bowl season, here's our player usage tool. On Awesemo, we have everything from projections, player projections, ownership projections, and slate write-ups. Everything you need to dominate college football DFS. But without further ado, we're going to break this down. And the first game we have on Saturday, December the 18th, is App State, Western Kentucky. This is a showdown slate on DraftKings because it has a very early start time, but it is a part of the FanDuel early slate. So we'll just talk about it kind of in a vacuum. But a really interesting game overall. App State, they fell short in their conference tournament, as did Western Kentucky. Of course, this game is a 3-point spread in favor of App State. It's a 67.5 total, most of that driven by Western Kentucky. They're the much faster team, the much pass-heavier team. App State actually prefers the run, but they're still fairly up-tempo. We'll start with App State. Chase Bryce is the signal caller, former Clemson and Duke quarterback. He's somewhat mobile, but he takes a decent amount of sacks, and he's really struggled against better competition. So that's a concern for me here. He struggled against Louisiana, but he does have some upside. He just plays more of the game manager role, 28 attempts per game, 232 yards. A bit expensive on this showdown slate, but you could still certainly get to him. The backfield is a timeshare, but they did condense their opportunity last week when they were in a competitive game. Nate Noel and Cameron Peoples are the main two options, and they'll handle a majority of the work. Very game script dependent, and as you can see below, App State doesn't really throw to their running backs. So that's a concern if they get down in this game. They're favored, so it's not a huge concern. And then Daytrich Harrington, he's been injured for most of the year, but he did come back. He'll be a change of pace here. The receiving core got a little bit of a shakeup with Corey Sutton getting injured, so you can see his price is way down. He's not going to play, so that's affected by DraftKings. Thomas Hennigan's priced way up, and the same volume. Only one target separates them on the year. Only 1 yard separates them, 776 for Hennigan, 775 for Malik Williams. So Williams is the far better price-adjusted play. And then the wide receiver 3 is Jalen Virgil. He'll step up and play this role. I'm guessing almost 1-for-1 for Sutton. That's what he's done in the past. We haven't seen it recently. But last year, Virgil far more involved. So he's a very cheap attachment to the offense. A nice punt here. Outside of that, there's not really too much you're looking at. They rotate some tight ends. They're going to rotate their wide receiver 4. So I think you're pretty cut and dry with App State. Western Kentucky, and positively they're retaining their OC, the whiz kid who's now the Texas Tech OC. He's going to coach in the game at least, so that's positive. Bailey Zappi, he's still not expensive enough. He averages 424.5 yards per game. Not mobile, but because of how many plays and how pass-heavy Western Kentucky is, he's only had one game below 300 yards this year. So Zappi's as safe as they come. They don't run the ball a lot, so it's risky to play any of the runners. So guys like Whittington, Cofield, Robichaud are pretty overpriced. Robichaud is the best pass catcher they have at running back, so he's probably the preferred option. But even he's not targeted very much. You can go down here and see their targets, but he's been targeted more than like Cofield and Whittington recently, if you look at the full body work, but that's even still pretty spread. So I'm still not too interested in any of the runners. The receivers, Mitchell Tinsley transferred, so you won't have him. But Jareth Stearns, the alpha, is still there. Like, I would rather play Jareth Stearns than Chase Bryce. He averages 130 receiving yards per game, 13 targets, and that should be even more condensed. But you have some pretty decent opportunity to buy low. Malachi Corley and Dawood Davis should be walking into elevated roles. Corley already averaged 7.8 targets per game. Davis, 4.9, which has increased a lot in recent weeks for Davis. But now we have a chance for the wide receiver 4. This is a spot where Kentucky is going to run 4 wide basically every play, but you're vacating a ton of opportunity in Mitchell Tinsley. He averaged 100 yards per game. He had 111 targets. That has to go somewhere. The most likely situation is Josh Stearns probably plays more. He had 2 targets in their last game. He doesn't have a lot on the year, just 24. But again, they basically use the same 4 wide every single game. Somebody has to step up. The second most likely is Ben Ratzliff, who's a guy that came over with Bailey Zappi from Houston Baptist. Craig Burt also transferred, so he vacates 19 targets himself. If you're punting off this game, I would try to go to Josh Stearns or Ben Ratzliff. A couple other potential options would be like Dakota Thomas, Dalvin Smith. They'll come in far lower owned, and they do have some chance of being the new wide receiver 4, but I'm not sure how high that is. Joey Belgian's the tight end. Getting into the main slate on DraftKings, we have 5 games. We kick this off with Fresno State UTEP. It's not the most desirable, 51.5 total, which I actually like the over on, but 11-point spread towards Fresno. They play much faster and up-tempo compared to UTEP, and it's not even close. Jake Haener, he decided to come back, leave the transfer portal. He initially entered, but now he's out. So he should play. He's not mobile, but he averages 317.5 passing yards per game. Yeah, that can certainly be exploited against a weaker team at UTEP. So Haener is a fine price-adjusted quarterback play. Very comfortable getting to him. They've increasingly rotated their receivers, but it's still mostly Jalen Cropper and Josh Kelly. Both are completely fine in terms of price. Cropper, some of his reduced role has been due to injury, so you could potentially see him pop back up here. I think he's a fine stacking option, as is Kelly. Then they rotate 4 or 5 receivers on the field. The wide receiver 3 most of the time is going to be Carrick Wheatfall, but Zane Pope, Ty Jones, and even Eric Brooks will mix in here and there. They're basically just dart throws, and most of your condensed opportunity is going to come through Kelly and Cropper. In the run game, Ronnie Rivers returned from a midseason injury as well. He's still the 1A, but Jordan Mims has actually played a little bit more in the run game of late. You still see most of the opportunity flowing through Rivers. He's a great pass catcher. He has 10 targets over the last 3 games. He also has 300 yards receiving, so very comfortable getting to Rivers as a favorite. UTEP plays decent defense, but again, Fresno just a high-powered offense. On the UTEP side, Gavin Hardison isn't the most attractive QB play. They don't run a lot of plays here. He has been efficient, but he needs to overcome his negative rushing ability with efficiency. And again, 248 yards per game through the air on just 28 attempts is great, but negative 52 yards on the ground. Can he reach a ceiling where he can overcome this negative rushing yards? That's my main question. But we have seen some really efficient performances. A lot of that stems from the strong receiving core he does have. Jacob Cowing averages 111 yards per game. A little bit of a tougher matchup with a 33% target share, certainly targetable here. Wide receiver 2 is Justin Garrett. He's just not quite used as much downfield. More of your possession style receiver. Averages 7.3 targets per game, but only 55 yards. 4,700 though is a pretty good price. Then the wide receiver 3 is Tyron Smith. He brings kind of a mix of both these receivers, but just not targeted as much. He has 5 targets per game in the last 4, which is positive, but still not very much. And then occasionally UTEP uses 4 wide, about half their plays. That'll be Trent Thompson, but he's far distant wide receiver 4 behind Cowing, Garrett, and Smith. And then in the run game, it's a pretty nasty timeshare. They're going to use 4 backs. Ronald A. Watt's been the leader throughout the year, but in their last game, Deion Hankins outcarried him 16-5. That's concerning to me. Hankins had been the lead back at the beginning of the year, dealt with some injuries. But either way, Quadres Wally mix in for change of pace touches, and then Ronaldo Flores is the pass catching back. So you got to get the right back out of 4 here for a team that's a 10-point underdog, not 11-point underdog. Not very intriguing to me. BYU UAB, a fun game to talk about here as soon as this loads. 55-point total, 6.5-point spread in favor of BYU. Both these teams are fairly slow, UAB especially. It's kind of like they both favor the run. They're both slow, but UAB is an exaggerated version of BYU. They're much slower and run heavier. Jaron Hall's been incredibly efficient of late. This guy has gone over 250 yards in each of the last 4 games passing. He's now averaging 258 on just 29.5 attempts. He's mobile, 307 yards rushing, a lot of that coming in the beginning of the year. But we've seen fantastic growth for Jaron Hall. They played better competition than UAB too, so he should find some success, and he's too cheap. Tyler Algier has not opted out of this game, which some thought that he would. But 8,600 for a back, averaging 118 rushing yards per game. Also very active as a receiver. He's another 15.5 receiving yards per game. Averaging 23.3 touches. He's probably the best raw running back play on this slate. You also have Lopini Katoa if Algier does opt out or decide not to play in the game. Again, not expecting it at the games tomorrow, but Katoa would become probably the best price adjusted play in the slate. And then Jackson McChesney would be the change of pace. A couple injuries to watch. Neil Pau and Gunnar Romney have both been injured a lot down the stretch this year. Tentatively, both are expected to play, but watch this closely. You could get one of the two playing, you could get both, or you could get neither. Those are the wide receivers 1 and 2 when healthy. But Puka Nacua has really stepped up in their absence. He's averaged 7.5 targets per game over the last 4, and he actually is dwarfed the rest of the receivers in terms of receiving, 72.5 yards per game. So Nacua is probably just a locked-in option either way. On top of the receiver injuries, BYU lost Isaac Rex in their final game of the year, and their backup tight end is Dalen Hooker, so you could potentially use Hooker. He had 3 targets when Rex went down last week. But let's talk receiver in case Pau or Romney miss. So Puka Nacua is the wide receiver 1 in that instance. From there, his brother Samson Nacua would become the wide receiver 2, and you're looking at Keanu Hill as the 3. So just names to monitor there. UAB is tough. They're implied for 24.5 points about Dylan Hopkins. He's a game manager. He's not mobile. He only averages 172 yards per game through the air on 18 attempts. They just don't throw a lot. They don't run a lot of plays. He's tough to get to. Dwayne McBride's the lead rusher. He got hurt in the last game of the year, questionable for this contest. If he plays, he's handled 15.2 touches per game, nearly 100 yards rushing. But Jermaine Brown's the change of pace, and he would become the pure bell cow if Dwayne McBride misses this game. Their third stringer in change of pace, Lucius Stanley, transferred. So there's not really a change of pace in the offense right now. It's either McBride or Brown. At receiver, they also had Rajay Johnson transfer, their wide receiver 2, vacating a decent amount of work, 15% of the targets about. Their leading receiver is Garrett Prince. In terms of targets, their leading receiver in terms of yardage is Trey Shropshire. But again, they don't throw the ball enough to really look at a lot of these guys. Hayden Pittman is the second tight end. They're mostly going to run 12 personnel, 2 receivers on the field at a time. And then the candidates to replace Rajay Johnson, it's A.J. Davis, it's Ryan Davis, and maybe Taywan Palmer or Samario Rudolph. I probably think that's going to be a timeshare. So yeah, I don't really think you want to target the min-price UAB receivers, but that's where we're looking. Next game, we have Eastern Michigan Liberty. This game is a 58.5 total, 9-point spread, which is pretty attractive here. Both these teams are fast. Eastern Michigan definitely favors the pass with a 54% pass rate. Liberty, 46% pass rate, so they're a little more run heavy. But there's drastic differences in terms of matchup here. Eastern Michigan is one of the worst defenses to make a bowl. So Liberty is going to have fantastic opportunity. Eastern Michigan allows over 5 yards per attempt on the ground. Let's start with the Eastern Michigan side. Ben Bryant's really struggled of late. Struggled to reach 225 yards against Central and Western Michigan. So even against the better competition in the MAC, he's been a little risky. But they do have the elevated pass rate. They're somewhat up-tempo, so he could easily backdoor his way to like a 300-yard game based on volume. He's done it multiple times this year. But he kind of needs that because he's not mobile. He has negative 26 cumulative rushing yards on the year. That definitely is not going to help you. So I think overall, Bryant is pretty risky, even though he's cheap. The backfield's a 4-way split between Darius Boone, Jawan Hamilton, Samson Evans, and it ebbs and flows on a weekly basis. If you want to play roulette with Eastern Michigan rushers, I think you can. But they're 9-point underdogs. The matchup doesn't favor them, and it's already tough to predict. I'm going to stay away. In the passing game, Eastern Michigan's pretty easy to stack. They only use 3 receivers, so if you're stacking Ben Bryant, your number 1 is Hassan Beydoun. Your number 2 is Tanner New. Your number 3 is Dylan Drummond. Drummond is more of your possession-style receiver. Tanner New missed a lot of the year due to injury, but he's averaging 9.3 targets per game when healthy. It's actually the same target amount as Hassan Beydoun. But Beydoun's a little more dynamic. He's used a little more downfield. I'm trying to get to either Beydoun or Tanner New in this offense if I'm stacking. Liberty. Malik Willis has not opted out of the game, so we're going to treat this like he's playing. He's the premier dual threat on the slate. He has 820 rushing yards, and he's one of the few players that has legit double-double bonus that would be 100 yards rushing, 300 yards passing. Now, he needs a ceiling in both. He typically doesn't reach either, but this is the matchup where you could see elevated efficiency. He's very safe because of the rushing floor. So I like Willis a ton. He's hard to stack. I guess we can talk about the receivers first. They use 5 of them. Demario Douglas and CJ Daniels are the top 2. But Demario Douglas has kind of seen his role decrease a little bit of late. He does lead the team with 61.9 receiving yards per game. Daniels second at 49.2. But in their last game, Daniels, 11 targets. Demario Douglas, just 5. And even going back to their second most recent game, Daniels has actually out-targeted Douglas in 3 of the last 4 games. So I think that's worth noting. He's cheaper than Douglas. I would rather pay down. And even Kevin Shaw out-targeted Demario Douglas in the last game, 8-5. So this is worth noting. Rather than take Douglas, who's volatile, I would rather pay down if you're stacking Liberty. In order of preference, it's Daniels, Shaw, number 2, Douglas 3, and then Noah Firth and DJ Stubbs. They play a rotational role, so you could get to these guys in tournaments because they're very cheap, but they are risky. The backfield's also a timeshare. Interestingly, Shedro Lewis didn't play in their last game. I don't know if he's healthy or not. There hasn't been an update on his status, but ultimately, it's probably not a situation to get too much anyway. Joshua Mack is the leader. He averages 10.7 touches per game. But Malik Willis takes on so much of the rushing work here that it's not really something we want to target. TJ Green would be the change of pace. For what it's worth, if Malik Willis doesn't play, Jonathan Bennett would probably become the quarterback, and then the rushers might get more work. So that's a situation to monitor. Oregon State taking on Utah State. Interesting matchup here. Oregon State coming out of the Pac-12. Utah State winning the Mountain West. 7.5-point spread in favor of the Beavers. Game has a 66.5 total, so we definitely want to be looking here. This one I thought we might be able to look towards the under. Oregon State plays so slow and run heavy, which is the counter of Utah State, who plays extremely fast but balanced in terms of their approach. Quarterback for Oregon State is Chance Nolan. He is mobile, 222 rushing yards this year, but he just suffered from low play volume in the Oregon State offense. There is a matchup to exploit. Utah State's weak on the ground, but I don't know if Nolan has enough rushing upside to really exploit this. I think you're probably just looking at the run game in BJ Baylor, who averages 105 rushing yards per game on 18.3 touches. Deshaun Fenwick is questionable for the game too, so if Fenwick misses, Baylor becomes an even better play. And then Trey Lowe probably is the change of pace. Trey Lowe's actually been used enough to maybe target in GPPs anyway. He's the preferred pass-catching back. They do not use BJ Baylor in this capacity, which is somewhat concerning, but neither are particularly expensive. The receiving core is really hard to get to. It's basically a rotation across the board. The only player with a consistent role is Trayvon Bradford, and he averages just 50 yards per game. For reference, you can play like Cropper or some of these other guys for just a little bit more money with a lot better role. So I'm not really interested in Bradford. But then the 2 is Tyjon Lindsley. The 3 is Zariah Beeson lately. Trayshawn Harrison is playing about 30% of the snaps lately. He's just seen a role reduction, which makes him a bit overpriced, even though he's technically the second leading receiver on the team. Tight end is Luke Musgrave. His role's pretty consistent. You could get to him if you'd like. Not very much upside with him. And then they do rotate in like Champ Flemings, Tegan Quitaranio, and Anthony Gold. So you're going to see like 3 or 4 receivers a decent amount, but they're going to rotate 5 or 6 on the field throughout the game, making it pretty difficult to get to. Utah State side, big win over San Diego State in the Mountain West Championship. And they're a team we definitely want to look at because of their play rate and pass rate. Logan Bonner's played really well this year. He beat out Andrew Peasley. Peasley used sometimes on gadget plays, but he's not healthy right now. So you should see full Bonner. Bonner's somewhat mobile. Very, very limited, though. He's more just a scrambler. They're not going to use him on design run, 66 yards on the ground, but he averages 275.5 through the air on 32.5 attempts, and there's a huge ceiling for Bonner. In the run game, Calvin Tyler will handle a majority of the work in these close games when they're behind, so he's quietly a back that you could maybe get to. The efficiency hasn't been good for Tyler. He's averaging about 75 yards per game on 16.8 touches, but he's been injured, and you have to know that Utah's very sensitive to game script. When they're blowing teams out, they'll use a lot of Eleanor and John Gentry, but when they're in competitive games, it is the Tyler show. So I think there's a little bit of an edge with Tyler. You can maybe look at him. Being an underdog is concerning, though. In the receiving game, Devin Tompkins is flat out underpriced for a guy averaging 123.5 receiving yards per game. He has been held below 100 yards in 3 straight games after eclipsing 100 in 5 straight. The thing with Devin Tompkins is his price has fallen, and I think people might get away from him, but the opportunity hasn't changed. He's still averaging 10.5 targets per game over the last 4. He's been at 11 or higher in 3 of the 4. The volume's still there for Tompkins, and you could definitely target him here. The wide receiver 2 is Derek Wright, and there's a little bit of contention here between him and Brandon Bowling, but I'll side with Wright. He's on the field a lot more than Bowling. He's just been a little less efficient. He has more targets on the year. Only about 20 receiving yards separates them. Wright averages 58 per game to Bowling 63. But at the same time, Bowling is the number 4 receiver in terms of routes run. So I'll just take the safety with Wright, even though Bowling's intriguing. You also get a little bit of savings on DraftKings with Wright. Bowling is the wide receiver 3 pretty clearly. He runs fewer rights. Punting. There is a big price difference, but McGregor on the upside. He's like a double stacking option for Utah State. And I close this out. Louisiana Lafayette taking on Marshall. Louisiana Lafayette lost their coach and a lot of their assistants, so they're going to be playing with a skeleton crew, but they're still favored by 5 points, 55.5 total. So we want to talk about them and probably target some of their players. Levi Lewis is a pure game manager. 269 rushing yards per game for him is fine. He only averages 200 per game passing on just 27.5 attempts. Marshall does not play great defense, but their primary weakness is the run. So I'm not sure this is a spot for Levi Lewis. In the run game, Chris Smith will not play in the game. He's hurt. And we recently have seen the backfield flow towards Amani Bailey. He's had at least 13 carries in 3 straight games. And he's been easily the most efficient in terms of what he's put on the field compared to his volume. Montrell Johnson should be the change of pace. You're probably looking at around 10 touches for him. And then there's a chance they condense all the opportunity to 2 backs. There's also the chance that they bring TJ Wisham and Terrence Williams up for a couple more carries. I'm not sure what they'll do, but Bailey's a pretty decent price-adjusted play given the matchup, and they're favored. The receiving game is a disaster. Louisiana Lafayette uses upwards of 8 pass catchers. Their leader, Peter LeBlanc, has played just about 30% of the snaps the last 2 weeks. He's really tough to play at this point. He's 3,800, but I'm still not really willing to get there. Kyron Lacey is about 50% of the snaps. The 2 players that are actually leading the team in routes run recently are Jalen Williams. Williams is the min price. He's led the team in routes the last 2 games, but he hasn't been targeted more than 2 times in any of them. So he's still not, he's more of your win sprinter downfield. And then number 2 in terms of routes is Errol Rogers. He's 3,300, 10 targets over the last 2 games. That's more than both Lacey and LeBlanc. So if I'm playing someone in Lafayette, it's Errol Rogers. They also rotate in Dante Fleming, John Stevens, Neil Johnson, Michael Jefferson. It's a disaster. On Marshall, even though they're the underdog, they play fast, they're pass heavy, so Grant Wells needs to be considered. He's not very mobile, but he averages 284.5 passing yards per game on 35 attempts. Louisiana Lafayette is not the stiffest competition, but they are a pretty decent team. So middling matchup here. Wells is targetable in tournaments. He's just expensive on DraftKings. There's cheaper quarterbacks I'd rather play. Rasheen Ali is probably the premier bell cow outside of Tyler Algier. He's just a dog in this game, which is a little bit difficult to trust, but he averages 102 rushing yards per game. And then as a receiver, he is an immense target upside, 28 yards per game. And he's averaging 6 targets per game over the last 4 contests, just like crazy volume in the pass game. So even if they get down, Rasheen Ali is a great play. In the receiving game, looking at pure receivers, Corey Gamage is the 169 yards per game for him. He's a bit overpriced, but he's averaging 8.8 targets per game over the last 4. Xavier Gaines, the tight end, very cheap for Xavier Gaines right now. He's averaging 38.9 receiving yards per game on 4.9 targets. The wide receiver 2's Ben Willie Johnson, and he's still playing a lot. But recently, Talik Keaton came back from injury, and he's kind of eclipsed Willie Johnson in terms of where he is on the target pecking order. 11 targets over the last 2 games for Keaton to just 4 for Willie Johnson. And Talik Keaton's return has put Sadid Ahmed on the bench, basically. Sadid Ahmed, 5,900, a guy that's not playing at all. 1 target over the last 2 games. It's Gamage 1, Gaines 2, Keaton 3, and then Johnson 4 for me, with Ahmed and Jaden Harrison and Stone Scarcell as these rotational receivers I don't have a lot of interest in. But that's the slate. Let me know in the comments section who your favorite plays are. Would love to hear it. We'll be keeping you around all bowl season, so make sure to check out the videos. I'm Matt Gajewski on Twitter at Matt_Gajewski. Thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you again next time.